Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. I thought I would answer your emails. This first email is from listener Rachel from Israel. She writes, I've just found out that my boyfriend watches porn. What does this mean? I don't feel particularly hurt by it, but should I? We very much love each other, and he told me he only watches porn when we don't do sex for a while. For example, when I'm on my period, we sometimes don't do it for a week. End of email. Yeah, I think everyone has their own sense of this. And in thinking about it, I read your email a little bit ago, and I've been thinking about it. I think one way the way I think about it is that we all understand that there's a spectrum between monogamy and polyamory, or ethical non-monogamy. And my way of thinking is that whether people are born this way or they just develop into this, there are some people that are just oriented seemingly consistently towards monogamy or polyamory or somewhere in between, meaning that, like for me, I'm oriented towards monogamy. Me and my wife are monogamous, and I don't have any itch to be with other people. I don't lament not being able to be with other people. Is that an orientation? Is it in my DNA? Is it just my life choices? Who knows? But I'm very content, and looking out, throughout my life, I've been, very much oriented towards monogamy. And so other people are oriented towards polyamory, meaning that they want to be with many people, or two or more. And when they're in a monogamous relationship, for the most part, it's rough on them. And although they're getting some of their needs met, they're not getting all their needs met. And so in the same way with pornography, that for some people, they seem to be, whether it's an orientation or the way they developed or their values or whatever, that if their partner, and there's a spectrum from watching pornography with your partner actively, and both partners watch pornography on their own and with their partner, and there's celebration of that, and they're totally fine with it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are 100% against it. And I'm not talking about the value or the morality of porn, which I'll get into in a second, but I'm talking about, whether the industry is ethical or not. What I'm talking about is whether it's okay with you that your partner looks at those kinds of things, whether it's pictures or videos or whatever. And for those people who are very much against it, their primary pain is that when they think about their partner looking at and lusting after other people, it threatens their attachment, and it threatens their self-esteem, which is totally fine. I'm not going to stigmatize that at all. In sex positive circles, sometimes that can be stigmatized as limiting and backward in some ways, and I don't believe that. I think it's fine if that's what you believe, and you shouldn't be forced to change your mind. And of course, there's everything in between, where some people are okay with some porn some of the time, or particular kinds of porn. I've talked with couples where the wife is, say, Asian, and she doesn't want her white husband to look at Asian porn. He can look at porn of any other ethnicity, but just not Asian, because she wants to be seen as the only Asian woman in his life, or it just feels weird to be looking at Asian, pornography actresses or something, actors. That's not a real example from my practice, but it's close to an example that I worked with. And so there's a lot of things in between. There's, don't ask, don't tell. There's ask and tell. There's various different policies that I think, given your development, given your makeup, your values, your lifestyle, your attachment style, for example, you can determine that. And I've worked with a lot of individuals and couples on this issue. It's worth exploring. As an asterisk, people will sometimes email in and say to me that I should be speaking out more against porn. And of course, there are truly evil aspects to the pornography industry, meaning that there are literal sex slaves and sex trafficking that is occurring to these, quote unquote performers, but they're, essentially slaves. And they might be in the United States, they might be in another country, because that's the thing about pornography is it's on the internet. And so anyone in any country can put something up on the internet and sell it. And there's a lot of money in it, particularly if you're in a developing country, because you can charge developed nations prices and make a lot of money relative to what you would get at a regular job in your community in a third world country. And so the incentives are there, the economics are there to exploit. And if you don't have regulations and laws and avenues that, what am I looking for? Exploited. If you don't have avenues for exploited individuals to seek justice and safety, then it perpetuates this harm to people, and that's absolutely happening. It's happening right now. I don't know the stats. It might even be increasing because pornography money is always increasing over time. So there's that. Absolutely. Having said that, there is plenty of pornography that is completely ethically made, meaning that everyone is doing it voluntarily. Now, some feminists will say, and I agree with this to some extent, that we have this, we tell women that all they are sexual objects and they're not worth anything else and they don't amount to anything other than that. And so you create a societal system that tells women that this is their only value. And by the way, you're also you're told that you're degrading yourself by doing that. So there's all these messages. Then, of course, you create this whole industry where men are paying to exploit women. There's an aspect of that too, where, so we don't have to include straight up sex slavery and sex trafficking, human trafficking, to point at unethical practices or elements within the industry. Having said all that, there are plenty of pornography producers that are completely, under any metric, ethical and empowering and within the control of the performers, more so every day with OnlyFans and other kinds of outlets where it's essentially, direct from performer to customer, and you don't have to go through a middle person or someone who can exploit you. In some ways, it's like this podcast in a lot of ways. Like back in the day, I would have to sell this show to a radio, broadcaster, and they would take 99% of the income. They would tell me what I could say and what I couldn't say. Whereas I'm going direct to you. I'm recording this and I'm uploading it to the internet and you're downloading it. And there's a lot of pornography producers who are the same way, and they get to dictate their schedule. They get to dictate what they do. They get to dictate what their body does. And they take, 90% of the revenue or something. So there's that. And there's also corporation level pornography that is also ethical and run by people of various genders, not just men, not just women, but also trans and other folks. So it's a diverse industry. In the same way, and the problem though is that we have a society, and societies around the world are, puritanical or Victorian or anti-sex or something, and so I find that the discourse around pornography tends to be pretty childish, simplistic, or narrow, or straw man-ish. It's similar to, there's a lot of industries like this, like the textile or garment industry, clothes industry. There are shoes and shirts and pants that you can buy that are absolutely being made by exploited labor. And when you buy a shirt from, the Gap or Nordstrom or something, and you're wearing it around town and someone says like, who made that shirt? And you're like, oh, it's from the Gap. And they're like, well, the Gap exploits sweatshop individuals in, poor communities in, Asia, East Asia. And you would say, oh, really? And you wouldn't know, you wouldn't feel, I would hope that you wouldn't feel horrible about yourself. I would hope that you'd be like, oh, I didn't know that. How was I supposed to know that? Because the governments, we rely on government to look into this sort of thing. And I suppose the media. to inform the government and to have regulations around those things, where your government says we literally will not import garments that are made from exploited workers. We're just not going to do that. And so as consumers, we can't investigate every single thing that we buy. That's just not humanly possible in today's global market. So we have governments that do that for us. And pornography should be the same way. And we're heading in that direction. But because we have such a puritanical society and government, there's not a lot of discussion around labor rights and safety and non-exploitation. It's similar to sex work, right? It's just like it's this off the grid to some extent. Now, I know some people will say, no, pornography is definitely on the grid in the United States, and it very much can be. There's certainly a lot of it that is, but when you talk about the global market, then you're talking very much off the grid to some extent. Anyway. So, but when it comes to pornography discussions, people will say you shouldn't consume pornography because of these incidents of exploitation, and you should just completely not consume any of it. As if it'd be the same thing to say, because there are exploitation of workers on garments and clothes, you should not buy any clothes ever. You should grow your own clothes, or only buy clothes from someone who you physically saw growing the cotton and making the clothes down the street or something. And we all understand that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we have to bring it out in the open. We have to start talking about it. We have to start advocating. We have to start putting laws and regulations on, the internet, essentially, and saying, like, unless this pornography is certified, then we're not gonna show it in the United States. And we have plenty of laws that address this sort of thing already. Like, for example, child pornography cannot be seen in the United States. It's illegal. And we could make non-certified, non-exploitative, or we could make non-certified, i.e. exploitative pornography illegal in the United States. But to blame the individual who is on good faith, probably consuming porn, hoping that it is non-exploitative, is there. Now, there's obviously pornography. Pornography is literally everything that is humanly possible, given human bodies and the human mind, is made under the umbrella of pornography. So when some people think about pornography, they think about a particular thing of pornography, and they'll say, well, what about that? What about this disgusting corner of pornography? And sure, there are questionable corners of pornography, but we don't want to paint the entire industry in that way. Research shows that pornography can have some good effects. One, it is pleasurable to people, just like any other entertainment. If people use it for masturbation purposes, there's a lot of health and psychological benefits to masturbation. There can be negative effects for sure, like anything else. But there's that. It can help people to normalize certain fetishes that they have. There's research that shows that there's a lot of sex shame in our society, and then when they look online and they see people enjoying particular things that they enjoy, they're like, oh, maybe, or they see a community of people enjoying a particular kind of pornography, they're like, oh, I guess I have my people, and that's okay. There's obviously bad parts of porn where it makes certain sexual acts seem extremely normal. There can be pretty aggressive sexual acts, which aren't bad. Some people like aggressive sex, but it can socialize young people to believe that certain things are extremely normal when in fact they're not. The research is showing that this effect is not as large as what we would think. We have a generation of people in their 20s and 30s right now that grew up with internet porn, and we don't see extremely high rates of sexual, problems with those people. There are things, like you could even say that one of the biggest effects of porn on young people today, people in their 20s, is loneliness. In that if you can get your sexual needs met and all of your social needs met on Instagram and your sexual needs met on the internet with internet porn, then you have less reason to leave the house. And when you have less reason to leave the house, you have more social anxiety, and your friends don't leave the house either. And so everyone's stuck at home and lonely and depressed and anxious, and their life lacks meaning, and they don't have their attachment needs met. So if anything, online pornography, along with every other online, thing that's delivered to humans, absolutely seems to be contributing to the loneliness epidemic around the world, particularly in Western society, because, Western people have just a lot of internet. And, but yeah, obviously there are effects on, and there are, there's research that shows that young people have kind of a twisted view of sexuality. But what seems to be happening is that when these people who were socialized by porn actually start having sex, they kind of iron it out. It's like they might have this weird version, but when they actually start interfacing physically with other people, maybe there's some mistakes that are made early on, but as long as they're kind and exploratory, they eventually find satisfactory sexual lives that don't involve the twisted, distorted view that they internalized growing up. There's also, body shaming that can happen from the consumption of porn, because there are certain exaggerated body parts that will be more prevalent in pornography. Not always, but commonly, that can make people of all genders feel inadequate. And obviously that's not okay, but that is a problem in all print media, in all photoshopped experiences, in movies. Just watch movies and just notice the strangeness of the actors, the how thin they are and how beautiful they are and how wonderful their hair looks all the time and their skin, and so we have a problem in general in all visual media involving human bodies that will privilege others and oppress others. There's also a racism thing in pornography. You could point to that, but again, you could accuse Hollywood of the same thing. I'm not saying that we don't address it, but it's not like we need to single out pornography as this horrible thing. And what I find is that the puritanical Victorian attitudes they amp up all of the criticisms against porn times 10. Like, all the criticisms you hear against pornography are, or not all, but many are completely valid, but they get multiplied by 10 because people have basically a porn panic or a sex negative, or they just don't understand porn. They haven't used it themselves. They don't consume it themselves, and it grosses them out. And it's like, okay, don't yuck other people's yum. How about that kind of thing? So, there's a lot to say, and there's a lot of research, and there's a lot of nuances to what I'm saying. But what I'm advocating for is sex positivity, regulations, non-exploitation, power to the performers, don't yuck other people's yum, understanding that there are ethical pornography outlets that are ethically made and not necessarily the stereotypical pornography thing that you might sort of have in your mind if you're not a frequent consumer of pornography. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. All right. So getting to your email, listener Rachel from Israel, you said, just reading it again. I just found out that my boyfriend watches porn. What does it mean? I don't feel particularly hurt, but should I? Well, right. So getting back to what I was saying earlier in terms of there are people on various ends of the spectrum. And what I'll say about that spectrum is, for some people, they haven't really thought about it much, and they've sort of internalized a lot of messages from society, and their knee-jerk reaction to their partner looking at porn or themselves looking at porn isn't really necessarily what they themselves would believe if they took the time to explore. For example, you could grow up in a very fundamentalist family and have a lot of sex negativity and a lot of sort of extreme ideas about all sorts of things, and you get married and you're like completely anti-porn. But then you start to explore things, and I've worked with clients in this situation. You start to explore things, you start to explore general sex positivity, your own sexuality, what sex means to you, and you start to make some personal choices instead of following the indoctrination of your childhood and wherever you were at. And you land somewhere else. Maybe you retain the anti-porn position, but maybe you don't. And so for some people, when I see them in my office, where they are at regarding all sorts of things regarding sex is not where they end up after exploration. And, I allow people to, obviously land wherever they land. I'm not advocating for anything. Like I said earlier, if someone decides that they're anti-porn and we go on an exploration and they retain the anti-porn attitude, I'm 100% behind that. To me, it's all a matter of, did you land on a position from an informed and flexible place? Were you allowed to develop your own ideas about these sorts of things? Of course, that's a fuzzy idea because none of us really have our own ideas. It's all part of society. But, did you have options, and did you voluntarily, with information, with the correct information, make a determination? In the same way that, in my mind, some people are forced into monogamy, for example, when they are oriented towards polyamory. And so we want to allow people to explore that. If they end up landing, with exploration of polyamorous ideas and open relationship, non-monogamous ideas, they're still monogamous after that, then it's like, oh, okay. But you can't, just because someone is monogamous in today's society, you can't know if they're truly monogamous. Whereas if someone is polyamorous, in all likelihood, they absolutely are polyamorously oriented because they had to go against so many things in society. And in a similar way, if someone is anti-porn and they come from an anti-porn culture, you can't know if they're actually anti-porn. And by anti-porn, I mean, they don't want to consume it and they don't want their partner to consume it. We can't really know if that's their true attitude because that's such a common attitude in society, particularly in certain circles. And so we would want to help them explore. And if they still land in the same place at the end of that, then it's like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. But some people might just believing that because they've been brainwashed, essentially. So for you, Rachel, you're like, my boyfriend watches porn. What does it mean? So I think what you're saying there is that, does it mean that my boyfriend doesn't want to be with me? Not necessarily. It can, for sure, but not, statistically not likely. A lot of people, various genders, look at porn, and it doesn't mean anything in terms of their dedication to their current spouse. It can, but that wouldn't be my first assumption. It can. Sometimes, people will assume, oh, does that mean that I'm not a good lover in bed? No, it can mean that, but that wouldn't be my first assumption. What my first assumption would be is if Rachel came to me as a client, said, my boyfriend watches porn. I just found out, what do I do about it? I just just ask him, just say, what's going on? And as a larger question, let's talk openly about our sexuality and our sex. Are things going well for the two of us? Are there more things we want to do? Is porn a replacement, or is it just an adjunct? One of the things about masturbation, which pornography is often involved with, is that it's often seen as like a secondary or a lesser sexual experience. No, masturbation for some people is not only an equal to in-person sex, but maybe even superior in terms of the enjoyment that one gets out of it. And it's all okay. There's nothing wrong with being like, hey, I like masturbation more than having sex with my spouse. That could be an indication of like, oh, maybe look at improving your sexual relationship with your spouse. But there's no way to, anyway, my point is that to bar someone from having self-pleasure just because you don't like it is, I don't know, if that's like your first reaction, I think that's unfair. I think that for some people, masturbation is the same as like taking a hike or just, reading a book. It's or getting a massage or something. It's something that they do for themselves, and it's something that gives them pleasure. It's relaxation. It's an escape. Whatever it is, and it doesn't mean you have to allow it. And this is why it's so important that you know who you are sexually as soon as you can, so that when you start dating, you can tell people right away. You could literally say in your dating profile on Tinder, I don't want a partner who watches porn. These are the sorts of things you have to find out. In the same way that you don't, if you're, gay, you don't want to date a heterosexual person and vice versa, right? You want to find your people. You want to find people that are compatible with you. And so when it comes to pornography, it's one of those issues. You want to discover who you are, and then you got to find other, because, there are other people that don't watch porn and don't want to do that sort of thing. Whereas there are other people that do, but we live in such a sex shaming society that these issues won't come up for years. People will date, get married, have kids, and then 10 years in, it's like, oh, you watch porn? It was never discussed. Why? Because, we have a ridiculous society. And then you say, I don't feel particularly hurt by my boyfriend watching porn, but should I be hurt? No. I mean, if I'm guessing the fact that you're not hurt indicates that you're not at that end of the spectrum that is oriented anti-porn. And it's not just, again, porn. It's the act of thinking about your boyfriend looking at images of other people and getting turned on by it, or fantasizing about other people. Some people are okay with that, and some people aren't. There's a number of emails here about pornography that I'm going to read as well. But first, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So I want to do an OPP, an old patron praise. These people became a patron in April of 2019 and have stayed patrons ever since. So not only did they become a patron, which is super cool, but they've stuck with us through thick and thin for almost 2 years. We have Adina from Great Britain, London. We have Elva from Georgia. We have Vanessa from God knows where. We have Rebecca from Australia. We have Hayden from Texas. We have Monica from California. We have Charlie from God knows where. We have Jonathan from Great Britain. Louise from Great Britain. Donna from Texas. Caroline from God knows where. Agata from Poland, I believe that is. We have Danny from God knows where. Eswat from God knows where. Svetlana from Toronto. We have Anetta from God knows where. Katarina from Sweden, I believe. Lydia from Sydney, Australia. So thank you all for becoming a patron in April of 2019 and staying patron this entire time, staying patrons. And if you want to become a patron, you can do so now. And if you become a patron, become an annual patron, because that means that you'll stick around a lot longer. Anonymous listener wrote in and said, I'm interested in your opinion on pseudo-incest pornography. I know that the general fantasy has been around for a long time, but if anything, it has grown in popularity recently. Now, if you enter a mainstream porn site, most videos are titled Stepdaughter This or Stepsister This. Additionally, how could this affect the youth who have completely unregulated access to porn these days in terms of their own development? End of email. Right. So just a side note on children being exposed to pornography. There are various possible effects, but generally speaking, it's not something we want to expose children to. And it can be absolutely abusive. I've worked with clients who were exposed to porn by their parents, for example. Like I had a teenager who had a lot of problems because of various issues of mistreatment growing up. But one of the elements of mistreatment growing up was that the father would watch pornography and get drunk in the middle of the living room and just sit in a chair in front of the TV and just watch porn after porn after porn. God knows why he was doing that, and the kids were, 5 years old or something. And this can absolutely harm a child. It is a lot to take in as a child. It's very, some of it can be very graphic, and it alerts certain sexual realities to children, that starts certain balls rolling in a very weird way that can cause problems later on. It's very much akin to sexual abuse to expose a child to sexuality and to be a victim of sexuality. We all know that has negative effects. And so we absolutely should be regulating it. And the problem is we just have this completely open internet. There's not, back in the day, there would be the adult movie section, and you had to physically go past a curtain. And today, trying to put up that curtain for children is really hard on the internet. I'm old enough to remember a time when it wasn't like automatically assumed that you would give a child a computer or a phone. In the 90s and even in the aughts, it was normal for parents to say, like, my kid doesn't have a cell phone, my kid doesn't have access to a computer. And so it was, you could really protect children from all the evil stuff that, pornography is not evil, but harmful things on the internet from children. But today, it's just, if a 8-year-old doesn't have a cell phone, it's some kind of like, it's treated like neglect. Like parents will call CPS or something, like, your child doesn't have an iPad? Like, what kind of monster are you? And I'm just like, how did that happen? How did, talk about marketing, right? Apple and Google, all these people, it's just like, it's like when they were trying to sell cigarettes to kids or something. Now, having an iPad for a kid or a phone for a kid, it's not harmful, but it can be. And so we, really have to think about that. But you were asking about incest pornography. I've given this a lot of thought over the years because when I first learned about this, I thought, well, that's a weird fetish, because like a foot fetish or other kinds of fetishes, you're just like, yeah, whatever. It's not for me, but what are you going to do? But stepsister, because a lot of the stepsister or stepmom pornography is kind of a veiled incest, because if I understand it right, pure incest pornography is actually illegal or something, or unethical. Like, it's not shown in the United States, but you can get away with step. And I think that it's coded as, well, we're saying step, but it's, wink, wink. It's actually real, And then, of course, they're actors. They're not really related. Yeah, so it's just a fantasy. So there's so many things to say. But what I'll say is that a lot of fetishes, particularly in pornography, and which reflects what's in our fantasy life. So our fantasy life is reflected in, pornography, in the same way that like marketers like Doritos, they figured out exactly what we want. We want crunch, we want salt, we want sugar. My mouth is watering. We want fats. There's perfectly dialed in foods that excite us. And for pornography, it's the same way. We've always had a fantasy life. And of course, it's changed over time as society changes. But pornography is on a silver platter. It's like, I know what's in your mind, and let me show you. Let me excite what I know you already are thinking about. And so this pseudo-incest fantasy has been around prior to the internet. And at first you're like, so wait, you want to have sex with your sibling? Like, that's not okay. But what it is, and there's a whole category of this on the internet. Like, I've done whole episodes on rape fantasy and how prevalent it is. They've done research, they've asked people, and a pretty good percentage, I can't remember the exact stat, but 50 maybe plus % of women will report that they fantasize some of the time about rape or coercion in their life. And of course, when you ask them, do you actually want to be assaulted? They'll be like, of course not. So there's a huge difference between fantasy and actually wanting it to happen. So, and it's the same goes for incest pornography or step incest pornography, in that the individuals, 99.9% of them that consume this kind of pornography, they don't actually want to have sex with their sibling. And I think that needs to be understood very clearly, because if you believe otherwise, you're like, oh my God, everyone is a sicko. Everyone's a molester or something, you know. And there's a huge gap between fantasy and reality. And the elements of it and there's no way for me to know this, because we'd have to open up the mind and understand what's happening mechanically. But what I think is happening is that I think have an evolved, and again, when we get into evolution and sexuality, it gets kind of weird, but there's certain themes in fantasy that I think point to a archetype, if you will, of sexual turn on that goes back tens of thousands of years. And I think one of the foundational sort of kinks that we have as humans is having sex in a sort of dangerous situation where we might get caught or it's forbidden. And I think that we evolved to have that because I could see early humans 100,000 years ago wanting to sneak behind a tree, because if you sneak behind a tree, then you might be able to propagate your genes faster. I don't know. It's hard to imagine what life would have been like for us back then, but there seems to be a foundational, like I said, archetype around sexuality of forbiddenness, in public with your stepmom. What other kind of forbiddenness kinds of things, like with your doctor, and like gynecology porn. Most people, 99.9% of the people that consume that kind of porn, they're like, I wouldn't want to do this in real life. This would actually be terrible. In the same way that I think we have an archetype around submission and domination that obviously gets played out in pornography. Do we actually want to be dominated, and thrown around and controlled? No, but I think it tickles, if you will, this feeling, and I'm sure other scholars have studied this, have articulated better than I am, but the step pornography, I think, tickles this fundamental archetype of forbiddenness that turns people on. So that's my explanation of that. And they've done research on that there's on various different kinks like this, that there's the fantasy and then there's reality. A similar thing along these lines is when people call men daddy, or women, you're a real hot mama, this kind of thing, or baby. Why do we call our, lovers, people we're lusting after, names like baby or babe or mama or papa or daddy? Why do we do this? If an alien came down from outer space, they'd be like, why do you always want to refer to your lovers as parents or your infants? Well, again, we don't want to, when you talk to people who use the word daddy or mama, they'll say, I don't want to have sex with my parents. No, that's absolutely disgusting. There's no way I would want to have, but so why do you call your husband daddy, especially when you're screaming in bed? Why do you do that? Incidentally, sometimes people will call me daddy on the internet. It took me a while to kind of catch on to what they were saying, like daddy, because some people would say, oh, our favorite internet dad. It's funny to get so old that people on the internet consider you your father. You're old when the internet thinks of you as a DILF. But anyway, but there are two different guys. Some of them is like, oh, he's he's like Mr. Rogers, he's like our dad, and, a comforting, compassionate, caring father. But then, so when people start calling me daddy, I'm like, oh, are they referring to like a sort of Mr. Rogers kind of dad? But then, people would alert me, no, they're sexualizing you. So, why would we do that? People, I'm guessing, don't want to have sex with their father. Now, Freud would beg to differ, but the way that most people think about it, experts, including myself, is that it's not father, it's authority. We have these archetypes of authority over us, and dad was perhaps an authority over us. He's, when we're children and we have a dad, he's large and in charge. He, knows what to do. He bosses us around. He cares about us. And we apply those select elements, if you will, of fatherhood or motherhood to our lust matrix. So again, if you just look at real common vanilla behavior, you don't have to even look at kinky behavior. You'll see all sorts of, if you just took it verbatim, it's disgusting. But of course, our fantasy life is not verbatim and should not be taken as verbatim. Listener Diana from Florida says, my husband says he won't give up porn, and that hurts me to the core. My husband says he won't give up porn, and that hurts me to the core. Some people consider his behavior abusive. I think that his lack of empathy toward how I feel is indeed abusive. I just never know how bad my marriage is, and therefore I don't know if I should do something about it. If his porn habit is indeed abuse, then it makes me feel like I should get out of the relationship. But if it's not abuse, it makes me feel like I'm overreacting. Do you consider a spouse who watches porn an emotional abuser? And would the victim spouse be subject to PTSD? End of email. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I can't know, Diana, what is happening, because it could be abusive, right? You could have a partner who watches porn, and you're like, hey, that hurts me when you do that. And then he's like, screw you, I'm doing it anyway. I don't care about your feelings. And it's a part of a general callousness and abuse that's occurring in the relationship. It's just this one component of it. On the other hand, he might, I wouldn't be surprised if your communication around pornography has been strained and not very comfortable for the two of you. And so it's possible that as you discovered, I'm guessing you discovered him watching porn, and it bothered you. And then, because you might be oriented towards like that end of the spectrum that doesn't want pornography part of your and your spouse's life. And you went to him, and he was hurt and he was shamed, and he, slinked away and said, stop bothering me. It's completely normal that I'm doing this. And, who knows what's happening, but we could imagine a situation where if we talked it out and there were a lot of other things happening in your relationship that were positive, we might find that one, he might be able to adjust and he's not inflexible around pornography, or two, the way you're interpreting it is not necessarily who you really are. The question I would ask myself, Diana, if I were you, well, one, I would go to therapy and couples therapy as well. But the other thing is do you feel harmed by him in general? Because if this is the only instance of him, quote unquote, harming you, then it raises a red flag of, well, maybe this, because abuse usually is a constellation of behaviors. It's not just like one thing that someone does to you. If he's a great guy and you have a great relationship and he listens to you and loves you and, is kind, and then you caught him watching porn and he refuses to stop and everyone is telling you that's abusive, like that doesn't really fit. And it could be, and I can't know that, but this notion that like, my husband looks at porn and won't stop, therefore I'm being traumatized, is not necessarily true. It could be, and you're saying, do you consider a spouse who watches porn an emotional abuser? No, clearly, in terms of what I've been saying. And by the way, pornography is often associated with men, but as our society changes and women are liberated from the shackles of sexism and misogyny, the shackles aren't completely off, of course, but as that we start to chip away at it, we see rates of women looking at pornography increase. And we also see pornography oriented towards women increasing. And what does that mean exactly, oriented towards women? Because certainly there's a lot of overlap in terms of what appeals to various genders. But we used to believe that, like, and I remember for, the first 35 years of my life, people would say men are visually oriented, basically because men look at porn and they objectify women's bodies, and women are emotionally oriented. And this is just a ridiculous notion. Just like it doesn't bear out in the research. People can have various levels of orientation towards visual stimuli, emotional stimuli, mental stimuli. We all have all of it. It's just a matter of degree and style preference. So plenty of women are, in terms of whatever stereotype we have of men and pornography, leering at a pornographic image and masturbating. Plenty of women are exactly like that, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? So we have to get that out of our heads. But this idea that a spouse who watches porn is automatically an emotional abuser is ridiculous. And then, would the victim of a spouse be subject to PTSD? Well, yeah. I mean, if you're being abused, then you can develop PTSD, sure. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron. She writes, I was listening to an episode with you and Bob, and you mentioned how filming sex in real life would be very different from pornography. A quick Google search made me realize that is everyone else's opinion as well. I'm confused because this is not my experience at all. I'm a 19-year-old female who has had sex with 5 different people. The first one was twice a day in a long-term relationship where all my needs were met, except I can't orgasm, in the way that we fit well together kink-wise. I like light to moderate BDSM where I am submissive. I also feel tremendous guilt about having any sexual desires, and that is something I'm working on in therapy. Therefore, finding this information amplified my shame feelings by quite a lot. How is real life different from porn? End of email. Yeah, anonymous patron, I'm sorry that we said that blanket statement. It's ridiculous. And it's something that's commonly spouted, and as your experience on the internet shows, that this idea of just like, porn is nothing like real sex. And it's like, well, some porn is definitely, well, so one thing we want to say is that there's a lot of variety in porn. And I find that people have, when they think of pornography, there's a stereotype or some kind of quintessential pornography image that kind of pops in their head. And I think everyone has a different version of that. But I think what people are usually talking about when they're saying sex is nothing like, real sex is nothing like porn, what they're saying is like, there's a certain common pornography style where you have an extremely tatted up dude who's like just bulging with muscles, and he's got a large member, and he is aggressively pounding is probably the best word for it. And there's, choking and, not like severe choking, but, there's slapping and hair pulling. And what I think people are saying, they're thinking of stuff like that, something in that sort of general ballpark. And they're saying, if you're 16 and you're venturing on your first sexual experience, don't reference that. Don't try to do that. Like, just take it easy the first, get to know yourself. Like, don't, and many women will report, like, they can tell the difference between a dude who has no idea what sex really is and a dude who has watched way too much porn. There's certain things that people will do, and I'm guessing of any gender, really, that certain things that people will do that show that they haven't gotten to know, like, their true rhythm sexually. Having said all that, are there super tatted up, bulgy, large membered dudes who like to pound, and, women who like to be pounded in that choky, slappy, hair pulley way? Absolutely. So the stuff we see in porn does happen in real life. Absolutely. So the blanket statement that me and Bob and I must have said was just like, well, sex isn't like porn, is ignorant and simplistic. So we need a more nuanced way of having that sentiment, because I think the sentiment is good. I don't know how to say it in a pithy way, though. It's just like, well, we should just understand that the stereotypical porn, mainstream porn, might not reflect the way that you want to be having sex. Don't automatically assume that mainstream pornography is the sweet spot, if you will, for you and your partner. But it might be, is the thing. You might have a 16-year-old who absolutely is into that kind of stuff, and that's okay. And so for you, anonymous patron, I'm really sorry that, it sounds like you've been through a lot of sex shaming and you're in therapy to get to, fall in love with your own sexual desires and be okay with that. And for me to stigmatize that through simplistic, ridiculous statements that everyone says is, it's not okay. And I'm glad that you're in therapy, and I'm glad that you're able to find your, exploration sweet spot, if you will, with BDSM. And you're saying, how is real life sex different from porn? I mean, what I'll say is that I'll just leave it at that. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron. She writes, is it possible for sex work to not be traumatizing? Some of Berto's comments in the recent episode discussing catcalling gave me some clarity on why doing sex work over the summer while I was in between jobs was pretty traumatizing and sometimes scary experience that I kind of regret. Of course, I respect sex workers and know it's not a monolithic experience for people, but for me, it was incredibly emotionally taxing and my self-esteem took a hit. I was being complimented all the time, but it made me feel like a shell of a person. Like, is no one safe? I guess this is what all older men think of me all the time, but they only say it when paying me because they feel they bought my whole personhood, even though to them I am less than a person. I truly hated most of the men I met and blocked all their numbers once I got a job in my field and moved, which I definitely recognize as a privileged position. I was having a hard time quite articulating what about it was so upsetting, but I think it was their assumption that I would enjoy their presence. Just their entitlement was too much. I wish there was some discourse around how sex work can be traumatizing without invalidating workers that don't feel the way I do, while upholding their right to protection. Thanks for reading. I felt like I could tell you about my experience without receiving judgment, so thank you. End of email. Well, I'm glad that you see me as a non-judgmental person. I work pretty hard at that. I wouldn't say I'm 100% for sure, but I try to be that way. I find it a much happier life. But yeah, I think what some people might not know, and some of you do know fully well, as you do, anonymous patron, but some of you might not know that there is a movement to support sex workers, to say, hey, they're people, they're humans, they are working, they like their job, and all of the stigma against them is sex negative and sexist to some extent, in a twist, if you will. And to speak ill of sex work, or to point out, because in the old days, or continuing today, when you are in the sort of vanilla mainstream discourse around sex work, it's all like religious and oh, that's gross, and those women are disgusting, and they're all like crack addicts, and they're degrading themselves, and all that kind of talk, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with. Well, there's a pushback against that. People saying, look, sex work is just a job, and the fact that our society, because of its puritanical Victorian roots, considers it to be wrong and morally wrong and makes it illegal is really ridiculous. I mean, who cares? If someone is consenting to a job of sex work, what's it to you? Two consenting adults? We don't question massage therapists. And I'm not saying massage therapists or sex workers at all, but I'm saying that it involves physical touch. There's money exchange. The massage therapist might not be fully enthusiastic about the work all the time, and some days might be kind of hard. It can take a toll on your body when you're doing massage therapy. Your back, it can hurt your back, and you can have repetitive movement problems with your arms and legs and shoulders and stuff. So, it's analogous for sure. And yet massage therapy, it's like, yeah, it's fine. It's medical. And with sex work, it's like this disgusting, gross thing that has to be done in dark alleys full of needles and stuff, So there's this pushback against that of just like, no. Y'all are in the dark ages, like grow up and stop oppressing these people of various genders, by the way, who work in sex work, and it's all okay. Well, then when you try, and as the anonymous patron is saying, not only was I a sex worker, but I support sex workers, and I'm supportive of the movement to support sex workers and to legalize it and to bring it out of the shadows and push back against the religious right and all this stuff. But at the same time, I want to point out some things about being a sex worker that were pretty awful for me. But does that make me on the other side? It's similar to the abortion debate and other kinds of, like the gun debate. If you're either on one side or the other, and if you're not fully on our side, then you are on the other side. And so if you speak out against sex work, not like as a thing and as a whole, but if you like, what, for me, sex work, or maybe for some people, it's really not so great for these reasons, then it's like saying to someone, you're fully in the pro-choice camp, and you raise your hand and you say, well, I'm fully on board with pro-choice, and I've always voted that way, but I'm a little wary of just saying that it's no big deal. It is kind of a human life, and can we talk about that a little bit? Do we have to completely ignore that reality? And to some people in the pro-life community, if you raise that question, you're out. You're of the enemy. You are essentially, pro-life. You're essentially anti-abortion. You're one of them. And there's a similar kind of bifurcation in the sex work discourse. And I think that it's a natural, I've been through this so many times with so many different topics that it's a phase that whenever there's liberation, whenever there's progress, whenever there's, heading towards progressive movements, there's always phases to it. And this is one of the phases when there's I don't know how to call it, but I'm sure that academics have some kind of term for it, but there's an in-group, out-group thing that forms where the in-group of the progressives, they find each other amongst a majority of out-group people. And they're like, oh, okay, I'm on the inside, I'm with other pro-sex work people who aren't religious right people. And this echo chamber builds, and a sense of danger is felt because the out-group is out to get you. And so if you do not toe the line, if you have any diverging attitudes of the mainstream of the in-group, then you're a threat, and it's scary. The nuances can only be tolerated when they feel safe. And if we want to eliminate kind of black and white thinking in a variety of topics in our society, whether it's race or sex or abortion or whatever, we need to first address the mainstream. If we push back on the puritanical Victorian people, then the sex worker in-group won't be so important for them to have these kind of black and white attitudes about these policies or, intolerance of nuance within their own in-group, because they're legitimately terrified of being dismantled by the majority and by the patriarchy. So, and this happens with like some pockets of Black Lives Matter, certainly, and other kinds of issues, gender issues. It happens, and I won't go into all the details, but I hope you get my meaning. So I think that for you, anonymous patron, you're just like, hey, I'm in the in group. I'm pro sex work. I'm on the side. I'm advocating for those folks. I'm sex positive. Obviously, I was a sex worker, but I'd like to raise my hand within the in group and say, it's not all peaches and cream. It's not all roses. There's some bad aspects to this. Like, for you, you're saying, and you are saying it's not a monolithic experience, but what you're saying from your experience is you hated all the men that you were with. It did not feel good. It felt like exploitation. You didn't use that word, but and it kind of traumatized you because now it's alerted you to the way a lot of men look at you. You now know because they would tell you or they would treat you in a way the way that they wanted to treat, the idea is like behind closed doors, they're doing things to you. And you're like, oh, this is what you always wanted to do to me. I didn't want to do this to you, but this is how you see me. And now when I'm walking out in the world, I now know what these men are thinking of me. And I don't like that feeling. So, yeah. I could see that. Now, you're, again, careful to say it's not a monolithic experience. And I'm sure there are some sex workers who are listening right now that'll say, no, that's not, yeah, sure, some men are like that, but I'm okay with that. And some men were really sweet, and I've had many sex workers, not many, but, a number of clients who are sex workers and frankly, friends who are sex workers and are, and they, there's a variety of experiences. I had a friend who was a sex worker for a while, and she talked about how she loved all the men that she was with. Not in love, but felt safe and close, and it was fun, and she had a lot of pleasure, physical pleasure from the experiences. She made a lot of money. It was, a fun experience. And now, is that everyone's experience? No, but it just depends. It's pretty personal, and I imagine it's also kind of luck of the draw. Like the sort of clients that you have could affect your experience, obviously. In some pretty dramatic ways. Some clients will try to really harm you, and there are rare cases, but cases where that happens. So I think I'm addressing what you're saying. Is it possible for sex work? Your first question is it possible for sex work to not be traumatizing? Yeah, absolutely. There are plenty of people who, and when we talk about sex work, there's a lot of different things that can be in that category. We have sort of the classic, picture in our mind of the John and the hotel room, but there's a lot of different versions of it. There's, non-sexual sex work, meaning you just sort of cuddle and talk and cry together. There's online sex work where, you never actually are in person with the individual. So, can it be not traumatizing? Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what the prevalence rate is, and I don't know how much of the trauma is a product of the fact that we, criminalize it and thus put it into the shadows and make, if you're a McDonald's worker and a customer comes in and punches you in the face, you can call the cops, and there are cameras and things in place. Or if your manager punches you in the face, there's HR, there's all sorts of, institutions that you can reach out to that will support you. If you're in the shadows as a sex worker and you're forced to be in there, and something bad happens to you, what can you do? And if you're a victimizer, that sex workers are vulnerable because of that reason. And so that's a problem with the system. That's a problem with our society. That's a problem with our stupid government. And so how much of the trauma that sex workers experience is an outgrowth of that? I don't know, obviously. And I don't know if anyone knows, because it'd be hard to, numericalize that situation. But absolutely. Are there examples of trauma? Are there examples of people who weren't really made for it. That's my experience, is the people that I have talked to who did it, who really took to it, and who had it and said it was pretty much a universal positive experience. They just seemed very, very suited for that kind of work. And it's not a matter of strength versus weakness, or I don't know. It's just, in terms of what we've been talking about this episode, it's kind of like an orientation. I'm thinking about one friend of mine who really took to it, kind of surprisingly to me. And when I think about her overall lifestyle just throughout her life, she, in a lot of ways, is, I don't know, impervious to the kinds of harm that can happen in situations like that. She sees it and she's like, yeah, whatever. It just kind of rolls up. She's just really above it all, if that's a way to put it, and excited about life. So I'm not saying that, anonymous patron, you don't have an excitement for life, or that you aren't tolerant or something, but the few people I can think of who had a really positive experience, I just think they just, or maybe it was just a compatibility thing. This sort of work obviously isn't for everyone. But yeah, let me know, anonymous patron, if I addressed your question. So at the end here, I'll just sort of tack on a couple other emails that were related to sexuality, but not porn. Anonymous patron says, what thoughts do you have on family members who strongly oppose a polyamorous life choice? After 15 years of marriage, my partner and I opened our marriage up. We put a great deal of thought into our decision. We sought therapy to help us process the experience and are so far happy with the outcome of being polyamorous. I expected some difficulties, but what I did not expect was how my family would react. They are otherwise progressive LGBTQ allies, and I was surprised by how negative and hurtful their comments have been. What hurts the most is the way they make it about our children. The assumption is that we are damaging them for our own selfish desires. However, we absolutely considered our children in the decision, and I do not see any evidence of them being negatively affected. I'd love to hear your thoughts on family reactions to this kind of life transition, opening a marriage, as well as our culture's overall reaction to it as well. End of email. Yeah. So, anonymous patron, polyamory rubs people wrong in so many ways that it's absolutely expected that people would have a negative reaction, not only family members, but also society. We have been so indoctrinated and brainwashed into monogamy is best and anything else is disgusting, particularly if you're a woman, by the way. And there's so many messages that are taught to us. It's in, there's so many movies about how, cheating is bad, or being with, multiple people is bad. You're a slut. And there are, you could argue that, what's her face's character on Sex and the City, like every single joke that she was a part of was playing with that idea. Anyway, my point is that, it's really, given the essentially desert regarding education for the public around this, it's inevitable that people are going to have a negative reaction. I did. When I first heard about polyamory, I was a clinician. I was like 10 years into my career, and I, started hearing more, because Seattle is kind of an epicenter for polyamory and kink friendly, sex positivity. In fact, one of the very first, I've talked about this before, one of my very first episodes of the podcast back in 2008 was with Alina Gabosh, who she died not too long ago, tragically. Her loss in our community was deeply felt by a lot of people. She was the head of the Sex Positive Culture Center here in Seattle, that was an umbrella organization that supported all sorts of people, kink friendly, BDSM, polyamorous. Also there was a sex club that we went to. Actually, it's a private sex club. She let us in, me, Berto, and Lita. And it's, anyway, point is that when I had her on the podcast in 2008, and you can still see this episode on YouTube, actually. I think it's broken up into a few parts, but you can see a young me interviewing her. And the way I'm asking questions, it's clear that I'm still not, I'm not on board with polyamory. pretty quickly, working with her after that episode and working with a lot of poly couples after that, I became very much aware of polyamory and ethical non-monogamy. And, it took a long time for my paradigm to shift. So, and I was a therapist and, pretty open to it. And it took me a while. So it's just, when you go to your family, so because you went down a road and you made all the adjustments and changed your paradigm, and then you go to your family who is still stuck in that paradigm. And of course, what about the children? And, I recommend talking with your family, helping them, showing them books. There's The Ethical Slut, I think is that the book? Showing research that shows that it doesn't negatively affect children. There are plenty of kids who grow up in polyamorous families and are absolutely normally adjusted. Can a kid from a polyamorous family have issues? Sure. In the same way that a kid from a monogamous family could have issues. So, and it's the same, it's the same sort of gay panic that happened with gay people. There was always, I'm old enough, it sounds absurd in today's world, but in the, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was like the idea of gay people was like, oh my God, are they just going to have sex with me all the time? It's like, no. They don't want to have sex with you all the time. There's somehow idea that like if you're not heterosexual, you're somehow a crazed sex maniac, right? And you have to disabuse people of that idea. There's this idea that polyamorous people are crazed sex addicts. And it's like, no, they have sex at the same rate as everyone else. Like, once a week, or I don't know what the average is. And, they put their pants on one leg at a time. They have all the same issues. They just happen to be involved in multiple relationships. They have perhaps a primary relationship and then two secondary and then like 3 tertiary or something. So it helping to normalize it, bring it down to earth, help people understand is it's a lot of work. There's more and more resources coming out. I'm guessing there's a fair amount of YouTube channels that you could point people in. So I sympathize with what you're going through, Anonymous Patron. I wish you didn't have to do that. I wish you didn't have to inform everyone. I wish you didn't have to deal with the oppression and the ridiculousness of your society and your family. But that's just the way it's going to be until we change things. And I don't see a tremendous movement around this. I don't know if in my lifetime I'll see the same progression in our society as we did with gay people. I with gay people growing up, it was totally in the closet and barely anyone supported gay marriage, to now a majority of Americans, including conservatives, supporting gay marriage, right? So will I see that same progression when it comes to polyamory? Somehow I doubt it. So, because I think monogamy is even more fundamental to our society than heterosexuality. And I think that's borne out in the fact that we're still kind of in the dark ages in our society when it comes to attitudes about polyamory. So, and it messes with like our legal understanding of marriage. Because like, what if you allowed people to marry 10 people? What if you allowed, one person to marry 10 people and then all those 10 people are married to 10 people? Well, how do you figure out the heir? Who do you call when someone dies? It creates this chaos, legally speaking, that I think our society will have a really hard time adjusting to. So, and ideas about parenting, like for gay couples, it was an adjustment, but for many people, they could sort of go, well, there's still 2 parents, right? It's like there's 2 dads or 2 mommies. But what if you have like 3 mommies and 5 daddies and like 10 uncles who have sex with you know what I mean? Like it a paradigm that's much, I think, more difficult for people to adjust to. I've made that adjustment. It's not impossible, but many people have. You have, anonymous patron, but I think it's harder for people. But we'll see. There's definitely more. When in the 90s, for polyamory was completely underground, and now it's pretty mainstream in certain circles, to the point where you can go on dating websites and you can click polyamory as one of your things, and that's been around for 15 years as far as I know. Mainstream dating sites will be like that as far as I know. But yeah, last question here. Listener Drew from Victoria, British Columbia says, I'm wondering if you think it is helpful or hurtful to allow long distance partners to hook up with the other sex while they are away from you to meet their physical needs, or if it would be enough to just allow them to cuddle and perform other non-sexual acts that would give them the same feeling of warmth. End of email. So this is a polyamorous kind of question, listener Drew. What you're saying is, in a long distance relationship, you and your partner are lonely, and you don't have any physical warmth in your life, and you're like, well, maybe just allow some minor hookups with other people to get your needs met, while emotionally you're still dedicated to each other. This is absolutely a polyamorous question, and you have to ask yourself, the two of you, are you on the polyamory spectrum, or are you monogamously oriented? For the truly monogamously oriented, this would be intolerable. It would hurt too much to have their partner, or even themselves, quote unquote, taint their relationship with other involvements. But if you're, significantly on the spectrum, a third on the spectrum or halfway on the spectrum towards polyamory, then this could absolutely be a way for you to get your needs met. But you'd have to really know how you're oriented. And I found that, again, it's something, once you explore it and really allow yourself to be whoever you are, people land somewhere on that spectrum. There are people who are just like, yeah, I'm not gonna celebrate the fact that my partner is having sex with someone else right now, but I'm okay with that. I know that she loves me. I know that she wants to be with me. And frankly, I wouldn't want to limit her in that way. If she wants to have sex with someone else, then I love her so much that I want her to have that pleasure. It's not the same thing, but it's similar to, girls' night or something, right? Like, if for me, with my wife, if she has girls' night, it's like I'm not invited, right? And she's having fun without me, and I'm sitting at home doing work or something, and she's out there having a great time with other people. Would I like to be a part of that? Not always, but yeah, for sure. I want to have fun with her, and I would like to always be a part of her life, and vice versa. And so, but I'm okay with her enjoying herself with other people in this date night, not date night, girls' night, going out, having drinks, talking, whatever. And I'm okay with that. There's a slight, there's a slight loss there, I suppose. It's not really that big, but you could imagine it's a similar thing of just like, I don't want to limit my partner. If you're but I'm monogamously oriented, so I wouldn't want my partner, Stacy, to be with other people sexually. But if I'm okay with that, and even though there's a part of me that wants to be there as well, but I'm like, well, that's kind of how I hear polyamorous people talk. They're just like, I just want my partner to be happy. And if that means being with other people, then absolutely, because that's how I'm oriented. There are times when I go through phases that I don't want to hang out with my spouse this week. I want to hang out with this other person that gives me these other kinds of things. And so anyway, you would have to ask that question of yourself, Drew, and your partner before you did it. But if you both are polyamorously oriented, then that'd be an absolute, and not only when you're long distance, but maybe when you're in person, or maybe only when you're in long distance. And if you talk to mainstream people, they'll just be like, you can't do that. That's cheating. That's going to break up your relationship. And it can, but it also might not. For some people, to allow that flexibility actually allows the two people to stay together, because we all know that a lot of people cheat, right? And so imagine if the idea is that with a lot of the cheating, not all, but some of the cheating, it's a result of people being polyamorous, people being shoved into monogamous lifestyles. And so if we had more education and understanding of our polyamorous nature, one, you would hook up with other polyamorous people, and two, you would talk about it before you had sex with other people. So it's not cheating. You would work it out, and you would talk about protection and about what this means, and do you actually love me even though you're having sex with another person? There would be a much more rational adult approach to these kinds of issues. Anyway. All right. Well, I got to all of the porn and sex questions that y'all emailed me, and everyone out there, and email in follow-ups. I'm curious what you think about what I'm saying, and I'll maybe make another episode about that. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.